Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Letter of Law Interviews. My name is Sarthak Bharadwaj, and in today's episode, I am absolutely delighted, thrilled, and so honored to be in conversation with Mr. Akshay Jaitly. I don't think Akshay requires any introduction at all, but just in case you don't know him, he's the co founder of Trilegal, which is one of India's biggest law firms. And he presently works as the president of 262 Advisors in France, where he advises his clients on cross border strategy and risk management. Other than work, Akshay is an athlete. He runs cross country marathons and is also a cyclist. Akshay, I am so excited to be in conversation with you here today. Thank you so much for taking the time out and being here.
Not at all, my pleasure.
Wonderful. So, Akshay, the introduction I gave of you is how I understand you based on your LinkedIn profile and online sources. But how would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Uh, I guess everyone has various different, personas that they see in themselves, and there's the professional side and there's the personal side, and even in the professional and personal sides, there are different things that different people get to see or that one presents to others. But I guess I've been a lawyer for more than a quarter of a century. I did have a bit of a career before I became a lawyer. So I became a lawyer relatively late in life, certainly by Indian standards at around 27.
Yeah.
And, I fell into doing corporate law. I had no intention of doing it. In those days, everybody, whenever you finished your law degree, you're basically going to join a senior counsel and become a litigator. And that's what I also thought I was going to do. But a complete accident of fate drew me into the sort of corporate law world, as a consequence of which I became a corporate lawyer. I enjoyed it a lot, and uh, which led to setting up the firm and the last 20-21 years with the firm before, of course, moving to France and doing something slightly different. But on the personal side, I think the first thing I identify myself is as a family man, I guess, as
Right.
a father and as a husband. And then, as you said, I'm a runner and a cyclist, and I think these three things: family, my sport and outdoor stuff, and my work. These are the three pillars of my life, and the three of the important ways in which I define myself, I guess.
So, Akshay, to start this off, I'd like to know how you got interested in law. Because, like you said, you got into law very late, at least by Indian standards. And you started out by studying history at Stephens and then international affairs at Columbia. You worked for 2 years with an organization here. And then you went to Oxford to study law. So, how did you get interested in law?
Well, I don't, I mean, I didn't get interested in law after I did all the other stuff. There was always some interest in law in the background. It was always a bit argumentative, I think. So, it was a natural tendency to potentially head towards a career that would allow me to do some polemics. But really, when you're studying history in Stevens or in Delhi University, especially in the mid 80s, the career options in front of you are few, and the number one option at that time for everybody was to join the civil services. And my father was in the IAS, and so I'd had a close view of government. And I wasn't too keen on that career, but what I, was most concerned about was the fact that I would have to study for years for an exam where my chances of success were infinitesimal. So there was something that I just thought, I didn't want to leave my career to that kind of chance. And also, as I said, the idea of a career in government with all its constraints was not for me. So the number two option, I think, for people who did history was to go overseas to study. So, what do you study after history? You either study more history and you do a PhD. I wasn't quite sure about whether I wanted a career in academics, although that was an option. And there's a sort of current of that interest in research oriented stuff that has remained through my entire working life. So I picked something that was a professional degree, but it had an academic content. And of course, somebody had to give me a scholarship to go, and you couldn't afford to go for these things. So I got into Columbia, I got into a couple of other places, but it was my first choice. It was exciting to go to New York. And the degree was fantastic. The, the one thing that they tell you not to write in your personal statement, which is that you're going abroad to expand your horizons, that is the reason why I went. I still had I still had no idea what I wanted to do for a career long term, and my parents were never the types who wanted you to be sure about what they wanted you to do. It was never like beta jaldi settle ho jao or anything. They just said do what you're interested in, work hard, and it'll come. So I did that. I did the degree, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I got a short stint, a short sort of temporary job at the World Bank, which was looking like it would become permanent. But I decided I didn't want to be part of that bureaucracy either, and came back to India and joined Terry to do policy work. And it was around the time of the Rio conference, the Rio Climate Change Conference. So just before that. So it was a really exciting time to be working in that field. And it was a situation where, if you were enthusiastic and willing to work hard, Terry was a place where you were handed responsibility to do stuff. And I was, I worked on climate change issues both before, during, and after Rio. But while I was doing that, I felt that, look, I enjoy the work, I enjoy what I'm doing, I like the place, I like the colleagues, but it wasn't immediate enough for me. I felt that the work I was doing, it wasn't leading to something which I could see the immediate outcome of. And law was something that was, felt quite attractive because it was going to have immediate outcomes. At least the vision that people have is you go to court, there's a judgment, and you get results, and people, get to do stuff with that, with those outcomes. So what I first did actually is I enrolled in evening classes in Delhi University while I was working at Terry. But it was a massive come down after coming back from Columbia, where everything was class participation. You were asked your views about everything. You were marked on your views. Here, I remember, I remember answering a question that the teacher asked. I put my hand up. I answered the question, and then I answered a sort of supplementary question, which I knew he was going to ask next, because it was the obvious next question. And I answered it. I was being, bright and enthusiastic and maybe a bit cocky, but he got really irritated with me, and he said, "You think you're very smart? You can leave the class." And I thought, this is really different from what I've seen in the last in a couple of years, and even in St. Stephen's, you would never have been kicked out of class for something like that. So I walked out of class and I never went back. And it so happened that there was a friend of my cousin's who was applying to Oxford and Cambridge at that time. And he came to me and said, "Hey, you've been abroad, you know how to fill out these forms and do personal statements. Can you help me with my forms?" And I said, "Yeah, what are you applying for?" And he said, "I'm applying for, I forget what it was, international affairs, I think it was." And I said, "Can I take a photocopy of your form for Oxford? Maybe I'll apply for law myself." So I photocopied his form and I applied for law, and I got in and I got a scholarship to go. And that's how I went to do that's how I went to do law. So it was something that was bubbling around in the background, and then fate intervened to give me that sort of opportunity, and that's how I went and did law. Um, the interesting thing is the coincidences don't stop there, because the manner in which I became a corporate lawyer was that I was packed up and ready to come back after my degree, and my mother happened to be visiting, and she said, "Why don't you do a couple of months with some lawyer over here before you come back," not knowing how the system worked, etc. And I said, "Yeah, well, I'm not so keen," and wanted to enjoy my time off before I came back and got into the grind, knowing what it was like to work under a senior advocate, and what I was anticipating. Um, but I remembered that when I was in Oxford, there was a recruitment brochure from the firm Ashurst Morris Crisp, as it was called then, and Ashurst as it became now and is now, uh, which had a picture of this guy called Johnny Searle, who was Stephen Redgrave's rowing partner for much of his career. It had Johnny Searle on one page in a boat saying Olympic rower, and it had Johnny Searle in a suit on the other page saying trainee solicitor. And it was an ad from Ashurst saying we are this open church, and we we have sort of Olympic rowers who are now becoming lawyers working with us. And it said at the bottom, we've got offices in, London, Paris, Tokyo, Delhi. So I said, Delhi, that's interesting. Let me give them a call. And I remembered that. And I said, okay, let me give those guys a call. So I called directory inquiry because I didn't have their number. And I said, can you give me the number for this firm? And they said, shall we put you through? So they put me through and the phone rang to the switchboard. And I said to the switchboard operator, can you put me in touch with someone who has something to do with India? And so they said, just a minute. And the phone rang through to someone's extension. And it rang, and then it bounced to a secretary. And the secretary did her job very well, which was to fob me off, which was to say, here's the fax number of someone in India, and get in touch with him and he'll get back to you. So I said, okay. And I was staying with a friend in London at the time, and I was lounging around the house, this morning. And I said, okay, that's the end of that. I'm not really going to send anyone a fax. Where will I find a fax machine? It was that sort of time. But an hour later, the phone rang in this house. And I picked up the phone. My friend wasn't there. So I picked up the phone and said, hello. And the person said, hello, this is so-and-so from Ashurst Morris Crisp. I believe you called my number. Now, this was the very, very early days of caller ID. So I was sort of in this twilight zone. I was spooked out, wondering how the hell has this person figured out that I've called them? And so anyway, I pulled my wits together, and they said, what he said, what can I do for you? And I said, well, this is what I've done, and this is the work I've done in the past. It so turned out that this guy had also worked in the World Bank before. Yeah. He was quite interested in my story, and he said, send me your CV. I sent him my CV. He called me up for an interview because I'd gone back to Oxford by then. Called me up for an interview. Then they called me back for a second interview and said, would you like to join us? And there it was. I was the first Indian lawyer they ever hired, first Indian lawyer from India they ever hired. And I thought, okay, so let me try this out and see how this goes for a bit. I enjoyed the work, enjoyed the intellectual content. I liked the rigor of drafting, and I got to enjoy negotiation and all of that. And then, that continued for a while. I went to their Tokyo office, came back to London, and then they'd said at that point, we've got this license to sort of open a liaison office in India. This was the early days of foreign law firms coming into India. And of course, we know what happened after that. They got challenged and kicked out and closed down and all of that. But they said, at that point, naively and optimistically, they said, in 6 months, we expect to have the ability to practice law in India. Okay. And this is, so I'm talking about 1995. So, here we are 26 years later, and that's no closer, further away, if anything. So anyway, after 5-6 years of being at Ashurst, I said, I wasn't an immigrant. I always thought I'd go back to India. So I went to my boss and I said, hey, you said 6 months, then it's been 6 years. Or 5 years. I want to go back home and do something on my own, set up a firm. He said, well, that's really impressive. Go with our blessings. And that's how I went back in the year 2000. So yeah, that's a sort of summary of the first part of my career.
Right. That's fantastic. And so when you returned to India, so how did all the partners at Trilegal come together, and how was the firm eventually established? What's the story behind that?
Well, there are long stories there, some of which involve a lot of wine drinking and other such stuff. But the shorter version is that while I was with Ashurst, I was working on a transaction which had an India component to it, or rather, it was an acquisition in India. And I was the quote unquote foreign lawyer on the transaction. And Rahul Mathan was the quote unquote Indian lawyer on the transaction on behalf of Dua Associates. So Rahul and I were both extremely junior in the profession. We didn't know very much about what we were talking about. It is a small transaction, so our respective bosses didn't want to pay much attention to it and said, let these fellows get on with it. Which we were doing. But when we were speaking to each other on the phone and exchanging emails, both of us thought that the other one was much senior than we actually were. So we were being very deferential and proper and whatnot with each other. And then one day there was a cricket match in Bangalore, and I picked up the phone. I couldn't. This is pre proper internet. So I picked up the phone and I said, Rahul, what's going on in this match? I need to find out. And that's when the ice broke between us, and we realized that we were just two young lads who happened to be lawyers but were more interested in cricket at the time. And that led to a friendship, which led to us. And at one point we were closing this same transaction a year or two later, and at the closing dinner, which led to lots of drinks afterwards, we got to chatting about what we were planning to do. And I said, look, I want to come back to India and do something on my own. And he said, well, I'm planning to leave and set up something myself. And then I guess it was 2 years after that that we actually set up the firm, or got into the serious side of setting up the firm. And in the meanwhile, we gathered up Anand Prasad, who was also at Dua, and we knew him that way. And Sridhar and Gorthi and Karan Singh were Rahul's, not batchmates; they were a batch junior to him at the National Law School, and they gathered together, and we said, okay, let's set up with 3 offices. And that's where the name Trilegal comes from. Most people think it was 3 people, but it was 3 offices.
Okay.
So that's the story of course, there's a lot of fill in the blanks there, but that's the short story about how we decided to set up. And the idea was very much from the beginning that none of us had family backgrounds in the law. Nobody was handing us practices, and none of us wanted to work for any of the existing law firms in India, because we felt that they were structured in a way that wasn't sort of compatible with the way we wanted to run our careers. So we started with very little, small savings, very, very small offices in 3 cities, and lots of goodwill from people who we'd worked with in the past, who sent us work and got us going, and some obviously massive, massive breaks of luck along the way, which if we didn't acknowledge, we would be being arrogant. Um, and that's how we started off. Yeah.
Wow. So when you were starting this off, Akshay, you were previously working with Ashurst, which is a multinational law firm. So did starting Trilegal at any point feel like a bit of a risk? Did you think, oh God, what if it doesn't work out?
It should have felt like a risk, but it didn't. Not because we were confident in our success, but it was a sort of, let's give it a shot. Um, and the credit I give ourselves only is that we did. It was before there was a startup culture really in India, and we were very much a startup. I mean, if anyone was, if this was a business at the time, which wasn't a law firm, people would have said, "Oh gosh, this looks just like a startup." But it was a lack of fear because of a lack of experience and a lack of sage analysis. We said, yeah, let's just see what happens. And I guess at the back of our minds, we were confident that someone would give us a job if we failed in doing this. But thankfully, none of us have worked for anybody else since. So it turned out all right. But as I said, it was luck and a lack of fear through ignorance rather than through some well calculated. We didn't have any business plan. We just had a vague idea what our costs were. We had a few people who joined us. We made sure that we paid them salaries out of our savings before we paid ourselves any money. It was 6 months before we saw the cash flows start coming in from the work we did. But that's one thing we're all proud of, that we made sure that anyone who was working with us was taken care of, and that's always been the case before we took care of ourselves. And I remember Anand and I sitting down and saying, how much do you think we'll do this year? And we plucked a number out of the hat, saying, itna ho jayega. And the number that we did was actually about 4 times that number. So we had a lot of luck, in the early days. A
Wow.
lot of goodwill.
That's wonderful. What a story. And like you said, to start off, you didn't really have a lot of clients. So how did that happen? When did Trilegal start getting business, and how did it become this giant law firm that it is today?
Well, that's a long and multifaceted story, which I'll only give you some angles to, because the Bombay guys and the Bangalore guys have slightly different stories. Rahul had taken some clients had followed him from Dua. Karan and Sridhar worked with Akshay Chudasama in one of his early firms, and took a few clients from there. And for me, I had seeded a few thoughts in the minds of people who I'd worked with in London, and people who were willing to take a punt on me. And this was both people at Ashurst, but also people who had left and joined elsewhere, people who had gone in house, and people were, it was remarkable that people were willing to take a chance on a completely unestablished law firm and relatively inexperienced lawyers. I mean, when we tell people that we set up the firm when we were barely 5 years qualified, people sort of wonder. And that, in fact, that in itself is a big theme. The fact that we were inexperienced is a big theme in the history of the firm. But uh, we did one slightly naughty and cunning thing, is that we set up an email address, a fake email address, and wrote to a few legal publications in the UK, and said, Ashurst Associate has, we don't know if you know, but this Ashurst Associate has gone back to India and set up a firm. So lo and behold, a few days later, I got contacted by, I think it was the lawyer, and said, and we did a phone interview, and they wrote a little blurb on me in the lawyer, which I'll dig out at some point. And a few weeks after that came out, someone from one of the London firms got in touch and said, "We saw this thing about you in the lawyer." And would you like to do this transaction for us? And the fact that I'd worked, with an English firm for a number of years was attractive to some people. It didn't make me a better lawyer than any one of my other founders, but it was something that some people were looking for. So that was one break. Then people who we went to law school with, or they put us in touch with people they'd worked with. So there are lots and lots of stories to be told, which at some point we'll have to put down in some form of publication.
I'm looking forward to that book, especially because I read Rahul Mathan's Privacy, which I absolutely loved. So, reading about Trilegal in greater detail would be a lot of fun. So, Akshay, moving on. Now, you have worked in a multinational law firm, Ashurst, and you worked in their Tokyo office, London, in India. So, you've basically worked as a lawyer in 3 countries. How do you think the corporate culture, corporate law firm culture is different in all these 3 places? And in some ways, has Trilegal tried to incorporate international practices in its own working? Or you've tried to sort of, be Indian in your own way?
Uh, I think we don't have a choice but to be Indian in our own way for two big reasons. One is that we are Indian, and we've sort of there's a cultural side to the way that we inevitably will practice law and deal with clients and deal with the firm itself and our colleagues. That's one. And secondly, we practice in India, so it's we have to cater to what the market expects at one level. But at the same time, we were very, very clear from the beginning that we wanted to have a structure that was merit based, that was egalitarian to the extent that it could be in a law firm structure. And we felt, not just because it was sort of some philosophical thing, but we felt that the best way to deliver value to clients was to have people who are motivated to do their best. And people who remain motivated to do their best over time are those who believe that they can at some point have an ownership interest, at some point become leaders of the firm. We didn't have too many other examples to look at within the Indian law firm world at the time. So we definitely wanted to incorporate those practices that we had seen, either because we'd worked in international firms or worked with international firms, to bring those in. Simple things like responding to an email the minute you get it, or as soon after you get it, as opposed to waiting for 2-3 days. And we'd seen these practices in certain firms, at least in India, and it was relatively low hanging fruit for us to do that if you just responded. And so thing was quick response. Understand why the client is asking you a question. The client is not asking you a question because they want to learn the law. They're asking you a question because they want to do something with the answer to that question. So, to put yourself in the shoes of the client, none of this is rocket science, but it's remarkably not practiced even till today, even in some, some of the larger firms. It's not done. It's done patchily. It's not done consistently. But it is very much part of the thing is that understand why the client is asking you this. Respond to the question. Don't give them a whole kahani about why the answer is what it is. So, for instance, one of the things that people have heard from me multiple times over the years is when you're writing a memo, you're not writing a mystery story. So you're not saying, you're not setting the scene in the beginning, saying this is the scene, and then taking people through excitedly to the conclusion where they suddenly it's a reveal as to what happened. That's not what the client wants.
Yeah.
Client has asked you a question. You say in the beginning, you've asked me this question. This is the answer to your question. There are some qualifications to this. Let me take you through why it's the answer to your question. Let me tell you why it's qualified. And you do, that's what the bulk of your memo is about. And at the end, you tell them, okay, I just explained to you why this is the way it is. And in presentation terms, somebody once said to me, first you tell people what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, and then you tell them what you've just told. Then you tell them what you've just told them. So so the point was to have that approach, which was more commercial, which was more oriented towards solving the client's problem rather than giving discourses on the law. Some clients like discourses on the law, and then you give them that. But 90% of clients are really not interested, especially if they're not the legal function of a company. So it was to service delivery. That was the first part of what we tried to do, and that was something that we didn't need too much guidance on, because it's quite self-evident. Any clever person, halfway clever person, will figure that out. So the idea was to take what clever individuals know, and to make internally, culturally, we sort of dealt with client matters in the same way and consistently. So people, when they went to different parts of the firm, they got similar kind of treatment, and they felt there was a trilegal vibe to the way that they were dealt with. That was one. And then, of course, we had this long 5-6 year association with Allen and Overy, best friends association with Allen and Overy, which massively sort of improved our financial management, our HR systems, all the stuff inside a law firm that clients don't get to see, and even lawyers don't get to see all that much, but which makes both the lawyer's experience as well as the client's experience that much better. So that massively helped. And the idea was, one of the reasons why we went into that relationship was very much to get that step up to international standards in law firm management. And then, of course, putting into place relatively soon after we set up a lockstep, and then soon after that moving to an all equity lockstep, which Trilegal still is today. I keep saying we, because Trilegal is very much a part of me, but I'm not technically in Trilegal anymore. So, but yeah, that's very much part of the culture. And what that does is, it leads to, if that structure is not just a structure which motivates people to do their best, but it also makes them confident in themselves and responsible. And you own this thing. You are responsible for the brand. You're responsible for the firm's reputation and goodwill. So do your best. And if the best means working hard, work hard. If it means getting another partner involved when something's not your area of expertise, then do that. Or involving another office, then do that. Or telling a client, look, we don't have an area of specialization over here. So here is someone else in another firm who's probably better suited to do that in certain cases. Not so much in the early days when we needed every piece of work we could get, and not so much now where we have all the specializations. But a client will be much happier if you point them in the right direction, rather than try and give them some half-baked advice about something that you don't know. And very quickly a clever client will be able to tell that.
Right. So I'll quickly move on to the final set of questions that I have now. One general theme that I often see as a law student is that, corporate, and this is what I hear from young associates, that and the environment in corporate law firms can require you to put in interminably long hours, because that's the nature of the job. So, what's your take on that? Do you think that those hours are important and necessary, and almost, they are necessary to be there in order for the proper functioning of the firm? Or should law firms try to sort of create a better work-life balance for their associates?
You know, we've dealt with this question so much, and this is not just a question in Indian law firms, it's a question in law firms around the world. Now, it's complicated, and it's got to do with various different variables, including client expectations, the changing nature of the working population, not just in law firms but more broadly, other options that are available for people to do, etc. Now, I don't think that there is any substitute for putting in a lot of hours in your initial years. Uh, what we've even thought of, so we contemplated having a slower stream for some people and a quicker stream for other people. It doesn't work because the guys who are on the slower stream want the quicker stream without doing what it takes to be on the quicker stream. So I think it's healthier for people to understand that this is a profession where the the economics of law firms, the expectations of clients, and also the expectations of lawyers themselves, both in terms of what we call work-life balance and remuneration, have to be taken into account when you look at how much lawyers work. Uh, can law firms do things to make the lives of their hardworking lawyers easier? Yes. But does that involve making them work, requiring them to work significantly less? I don't think so. And I don't think lawyers should necessarily want that. I think that if you're in the right firm and if you have the right bosses, if you put in a lot of hard work in your initial few years, or even even if you work hard for a number of months, and then you tell your boss that, look, I've worked hard, can I have a bit of a break? A sensible boss will agree. And 5 years ago, perhaps there wouldn't have been that many sensible bosses, but sense has been drummed into a lot of us by the fact that people are leaving firms, leaving the profession, doing something completely different. So I think there's a willingness to be slightly more flexible from the past, but it can't be, as someone said to me once, when people ask for work life balance, they in a way they're asking for life balance. And there is an element of that, but and also there is some very strong advice I have for people who are working in firms, is that you are not required to work hard every day. It doesn't happen like that. There are days when you can actually leave early, and this is true especially for people who don't live, who are not from the city in which they're working. People's social communities are around places of work, they're around the firms they're in, and people will hang around in the office a lot longer than necessary on a day where they don't have that much work, because their pals are working and they're waiting for them, and then they'll want to go out for a drink together, which is all fine. But then there'll be a day when you've got a new girlfriend and you have to want to go on a date, and you've got tickets for a movie, and that's the day your boss asks you to stay, and then you'll turn around and say, oh, ye law firm wale hamesha late kaam karwate hain. So you have to sort of, so my advice to people always is, you work for the day, finish, then go home. Or if you and now of course the world is very different, because with work from home, we are never going to return to the way we were earlier, and no firm is going to return to that. And people have seen that it is possible to get your work done and do other stuff as well. Although from what I hear across the Indian law firm world, the pandemic has been extremely busy for most firms, and certainly for Trilegal, which I'm really aware of the fact that people have been super busy. So I think it's figuring out your priorities, doing making sure you get in time to do other stuff. Maybe the time that you give yourself is in the middle of the day. You go to the gym for a couple of hours between 12 and 2. I mean, that is very much my style. There's always been my style of functioning. Break up your day. If you're someone with small kids, then go home at 7. Spend time with your kids and work again after dinner. There are all sorts of options and strategies. Admittedly, the more senior you are, the more flexibility you have. But flexibility exists for absolutely everyone. You have to look hard for it. So I would encourage people to look for it, put in hard work, earn that goodwill, which will allow you to take a holiday or to have a couple of easier days. And we used to do things, and I think to some extent we still do, is that if you're staying late more than a few days in a row, then you get asked by the partner you're working with, why are you staying so late? What is it that is keeping you so busy? And we would in the projects group in Trilegal, we'd have Monday meetings where we'd check people's busyness and see the extent to which we could move work around and stuff. Sometimes it isn't possible to do that. um, and sometimes people don't want to admit that they're overloaded because they feel that it's a sign of weakness. We have to change that culture. I think it becomes, you need proper information to have proper responses. And while I know that law firms don't necessarily always have the proper responses, if people who do care, and if nothing else, they care for at least their own business. And if they see lawyers walking out of the door after 2-3 years of having trained them, that's no good to them. So I think it's in their interest to give them a bit of a break if they can. And it's also for bosses to demonstrate to their lawyers that, look, this time I really need you, and not to keep people hanging around when it isn't absolutely necessary. And if an associate sees a bunch of partners doing gupshup for 3-4 hours and making them wait before they review their memo, they're going to be pissed off, and justifiably so. On the other hand, if they see the partner working hard themselves, and the partner coming and saying, look, I'm sorry, all the partner has to do is come and say, look, I'm sorry, I'm having to make you work late, but we've got this, here's why. And you're an important part of the team and you're getting a thing done. A little bit of encouragement is all I found, all that it takes to get, often all that it takes to get that goodwill from the majority of people, because young folks are also sensible. They understand that there are requirements, and it's communication which can reduce the problem. I'm not pretending it'll go away, but good communication will certainly reduce the problem.
Right. So moving on, and this we can conclude with this one, and then one more follow up. But do you think a law school really matters when it comes to getting a job at a big law firm like Trilegal?
I wish it didn't. I wish that one could judge people by merit, but it's sort of, what is it, by merit alone? But how do you do that? How do you go to a University of Punjab law school student? How do you find that good student from there? The fact is that over the last 25 years, the national law schools, especially the more established ones, have attracted, over time in particular, now more than ever, have attracted better and better students from schools. So those better students, when they work with each other and they are competitive with each other, they will produce better and better lawyers. So it becomes a bit of a self-selection process. It is much easier for a law firm to choose out of the pool of the national law schools, because you know that it's just going to be easier for you to go to a campus and find a group of students from which you will get a bunch of folks who are going to be compatible with you, going to be both good at what they do and compatible with the culture of your firm. So it's just easier to do that. Um, at Trilegal, we were always careful to, well, there were two things. One is that once we hired someone, there's absolutely no distinction on the basis of law school. So you're an A0, you're paid the same salary, whether you're from Bombay or Bhatinda or any law school in between. So if you're hired because the firm thinks you're good enough, and if you turn out not to be, whichever law school you're from, then that will be seen in the future. But it's if someone were to give me a mechanism, so maybe there's a business model for some sort of intermediary organization over here to collect CVs from the non-sexy law schools, and to do a good vetting of those CVs, and go to law firms and say, look, you usually look at these folks. And this would actually, come to think of it, this would have to be done at the internship level, because more and more law firms hire from internships. To go to them and say, look, you should be looking at these guys as well, because there's some hidden gems over here. I think law firms would be willing, at least I know that Trilegal would be happy to do that. because again, we want the best folks, and we don't always. So the trilegal equivalent is we don't always hire toppers. We hire people who we find go through our selection process, coming out being bright, intelligent, analytical, independently motivated, hopefully entrepreneurial in the future, all of that sort of thing, rather than someone who's just top class at their studies. Of course, if someone is top class at their studies on top of that, great. But if you crack the exam system and you're going to present badly in an interview, then it's unlikely that Trilegal will hire you.
Yeah.
So I think, so my answer is that, how does it's a sort of demand supply kind of problem that needs to be solved, and someone needs to step in to solve it. And I don't think it would be slightly unfair to expect law firms to solve it, because that's not their job. Their job is to hire the best lawyers they can. They have limited time and resources to do so, limited means to do so. But if someone were to provide that intermediary service that I was talking about, then I think many firms would be interested in that.
Right, wonderful. And so, Akshay, this is my final question. This is a question that I ask all the guests who have been on Letter of Law. Um, are you into reading? I know you are, because a few days ago you put out a tweet, I think, of a very quaint little bookstore and the books that you had purchased. So, what kind of books do you read, and would you like to give us some recommendations? Anything at all?
Oh, my reading is, it waxes and wanes in terms of both quantity and what I'm reading over time. Uh, I consume a lot of the written word. Let me, or and sometimes the word isn't written, sometimes it's spoken, because I listen to quite a few podcasts as well. Apparently, there's about 25 to 30% of the world population which retains information better by listening than by reading, and I'm definitely part of that 25 to 30%. But it depends on what I'm doing. I tend to have serial obsessions with various different things. So for instance, my wife and I went to Venice a few weeks ago, and I picked up a book on the history of Venice, and then somebody else told me, there's this book. We went to a particular island, and they said there's this great book on that island itself. So that's something that I'll probably end up reading.
Wow.
But so unfortunately, I don't read as much fiction as I used to. I would like to read more, and I think I'll come back to doing it. But I find that for the kind of work that I'm doing, and I'm heading towards more and more, I read a lot of non-fiction. So at the moment, I'm reading a bunch of books on the Indian power sector. Not very exciting, but I'm just starting to work on a big project looking at reform in the Indian power sector. So I'm reading a bunch of books to sort of to educate myself. I mean, I practiced in the sector for a long time, but there are gaps in my policy side of my knowledge. So I'm looking at picking that up. I read books on law, so on the various books that the various young scholars have written recently. Madhav Khosla's book
Ah,
and Rohit Dev's book. I like that sort of writing a lot. I like writing which takes a complex problem and dares to give you a viewpoint on it, and especially if it's looking at it from a high level. There are plenty of books which go into a lot of detail on things, but I like books which sort of get into the looking at things from a broader perspective, even if I disagree with that perspective. So the Sapiens type approach, which is taking big swathes in history, because it allows you to sort of zoom out, and you can form your own judgments about some of the theories, but you see history in context. So I read quite a lot of stuff on history of different periods. As I said, I'm reading this stuff on Venice. I read a lot of long form journalism. So whether it's Guardian, New York Times, a lot of the new stuff that you're getting that are online in India is 52.in, for example. I think they're doing some great stuff. So yeah, so it's a big mix. I read this year. I read Sonia Falero's new book, Good Girls, which is absolutely fabulous.
wow.
In fact, for the first time in my life, I was motivated to write a book review of it, which I started, but I haven't finished, and I will. If anybody used to listen to the, the serial, the podcast Serial, the first
Okay.
podcast that made podcasts what they were, the book sort of, it has the same feel as that podcast. So that's something I read earlier this year. I also read a book by a friend, who's the Jeffrey Gettleman, who's the New York Times correspondent in India. I think he might just be leaving, called Love, Africa, which is his memoirs, largely in Africa, but in war-torn areas of Asia as well, like Iraq and Afghanistan, etc. So that's another thing. There are so many of my friends who have written books that I actually have a special shelf which is just books by friends, and I will. I do not have a division between what I've already read and what I've not, because I know that some people would get upset if they find out that I've not yet read their book. So yeah, so it's quite a mix. It's quite a mix.
Right. Thank you for that. And I think with this, we can come to an end of today's conversation. I mean, I would have loved to unpack a lot of more things, but I do have to stop at some point. But Akshay, thank you so much for taking the time out and being here with me. I absolutely loved speaking with you, and I'm really excited to put this video out. Once again, thanks a lot.
Not at all. My pleasure entirely. Thanks. Thanks. Bye.